All right, so thanks again for doing this. My first question that I have for you is tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you started in the community. What was that journey like?
Yeah, that's a really broad, big question. Um, are you specifically asking like how I became a therapist or
Exactly.
yeah, okay. Um, so I think like most therapist origin stories are typically that we are sensitive kids, people pleasers, or just people. And so as a kid, I was really curious about people, and you combine that with kind of having your own personal history of trauma. And a lot of therapists kind of take that, and we end up in this field where we got really curious about why people are the way they are, and how we can heal from our own personal lived experiences, but also how we can like help people change and heal themselves. And so for me, I've always been curious about how to create change, how to help others change, and just about how people work. But then I also, as a kid, I didn't have very many good therapists, to the point where as a teenager, I decided I wanted to become a therapist because I was just like, it can't be that hard to to be a supportive presence for people. And my experience was just that the adults in my life were just really not cutting it in terms of being like helping me through what I needed help through. So
Hmm.
yeah, that's kind of from a young age, I decided I wanted to become a therapist, which made college really easy because, I knew what I was going to do. And I got my undergrad in psychology and sociology, which was super fascinating. And then I went on to get my grad degree in social work, which I really enjoyed. I liked the variability of that, versus like a counseling degree because it allows you to do a lot of different things, and it has sort of a social justice focus. And yeah, I started out working with youth because, that's kind of the seed of where I started. And so I originally worked with as a crisis responder therapist, and like a stabilization therapist in the community. So that means like going into people's homes, helping to de escalate crisis situations, helping youth who are really marginalized and have really significant mental health issues or are involved in the system in one way or another, help them kind of feel supported, get back on track, get the supports they need, and then, pass them on to like longer term support. So I did that for a really long time, and I really enjoyed that. And then eventually, that's pretty intense work, and you can't do it forever. So I eventually decided to open up my private practice where I started working more with adults, and I focus on neurodivergency because I'm very neurodivergent, and trauma, particularly like childhood trauma. And then that can get kind of lonely. So, and I was interested in some other things as well. So that's when I started my group practice. So now I have a group practice, and I like to do lots of things, including, not just limited to therapy, but also retreats and workshops and groups and all sorts of stuff. So it's just like
Hmm.
expanded from
So,
there.
oh,
So
so it's
that's the overarching.
so it's more expanded. So, and I'm wondering because you just said that you worked with youth, but now like you've transitioned to work more with adults. Why transition to that particular group of people? What were the reasons that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, So one, I love working with youth. And I do miss it. I do still work with some youth. Um, Particularly I hold like a couple pro bono spots for youth who can't normally access therapy because, their parents can't know or something like that. But the reason I mostly transitioned away from youth is one, because as a private practice, you just tend to have more adults coming in. But two, I was getting older and I noticed that like I just hadn't worked with very many adults. I'd worked with a lot of parents. Like when you're working with youth, you work with their parents a lot too.
Mm-hmm.
But I had never had the opportunity to just have like an adult be my client. And so, and I was really interested in that too, because adults have more autonomy and we are a little bit more developed in certain ways, and so we have the ability to like take action in some ways more. And that was something I was really interested in, is being able to um make do certain types of therapy that's really hard to do with youth. But then the other, and I think also as we get older as therapists, like our our scope typically shifts to I was helping youth because I was a youth in need. And then my focus shifted to like young adults, when I got above that age. And so I think that our it's typical for therapists focus to shift to kind of like a little bit below their current age, or they say that sometimes we're usually just giving therapy to the younger versions of ourselves, and so that like changes over time. But also, to be super candid with you, I was getting really burnt out on parents. Working with parents is really hard, and when you work with youth, you have to work with parents, and often parents are uh, a lot more resistant to change than the kid is, but they're the ones that need to implement a lot of change. And it just got really, after years and years of working with some really difficult parents and feeling heartbroken and frustrated that as a therapist you can't help the kid impact their life because the parent is stuck in their own stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That gets really frustrating over time. So I still love working with youth, but I tend to work with older youth, or youth that are like, you know, I still call them youth, but I guess they're technically adults, if they're like 18, 19, because and that's, comes with its own challenges, but there's a little bit more autonomy there. Yeah. So that's kind of the long answer.
Yeah. So like what to transition, like what sorts of methods or approaches do you use when working with adults? Like what sorts of practice like approaches do you use? Because I've heard of CBT and other
Mhm.
related methods, but like to your specific practice and your area of work, what sorts of methods do you use when you're working
Yeah,
with
that's
patients?
that's a really great question. Um, well, I'll just start by saying that my primary method is the relationship. So if you look at research on therapeutic methods, we know that the number one thing that works is the relationship. And I don't just mean like liking your therapist, or like, oh, we like each other, we have a good time together, that means we have a good relationship. I mean, like, focusing on, do you feel safe enough to tell me you disagree with me? Can we have conflict together? Can I tell you that I disagree with you? Can we be angry with each other in session? Things like that, that when you're working with the relationship in front of you, that's when you make the most relational healing. And we know that if you have a real strong connection and relationship with your therapist, it doesn't really matter what modality you use, you're going to make progress. um, it also is important that both of you are like bought into the modality. And so there's no one modality that really like works better than the other. All modalities seem to work, but they kind of work in proportion to each other. So I use a very eclectic approach that's really based on the individual. Um, and I pull from a lot of different things, but the primary thing is that I'm very relational, and I use what's called immediacy, which is talking about like how you're feeling in the room. Like if I were to reflect something back to you, and I might ask you like, how did that land? Or like, what does that bring up for you? Or I'm noticing that you shifted in your chair, or I'm noticing that you change the subject. All of that is like immediacy because it's talking about what's happening right now in the room. But aside from that, as a trauma therapist, the I use a lot of somatics, right? That's a very broad term. Somatics really is just talking about the body. So that's like what's happening in your body, eliciting visceral responses in the body. So I use a lot of somatics. I also use IFS a lot, which is a preferred modality of mine. We can talk about that more if you want to, or people can look it up. A lot of people are familiar with this modality. I also use a lesser known modality that's called narrative exposure therapy. I'm a big fan of narrative therapy, but narrative exposure therapy is really about kind of blending narrative therapy with somatics and um, kind of reflection and exposure to some trauma stories, like the trauma that you went through, um, in order to heal from that trauma. And that sounds really scary when I say exposure, but every effective trauma therapy has exposure in it. Um, and so you have to be exposed and confront the things that are really scary or that you're wanting to avoid in order to be able to work through that. And so that's kind of like what I help people do in all of those modalities. Um, so yeah, those are some of the main ones that I pull from.
Mm-hmm. So I guess my next question is, what sorts of common themes or common sort of ideas do do patients come in to see you and say, "Hey, I have a problem with this." Like what sorts of key themes, as you're kind of sitting there and working with patients, what sorts of key themes and sort of do you sort of notice when talking to patients? What's the common sort of
Mm,
thing that you notice?
yeah, ooh, that's a good question because I feel like there's so many. I mean, I think one main theme that sticks out to me is that people are lonely. People come in and even if they have good relationships, there's a pervasive feeling of being somewhat disconnected and like simultaneously overwhelmed and chronically stressed while also like under fulfilled, and that there's something that they're really desiring that they can't quite grasp or put their hands on. And so it's hard. It's a little intangible, if that makes sense. Like it's a little bit hard to even put into words. And I find that when clients come in, they have a hard time putting it into words too. Um, and it manifests in a lot of different ways. Like but usually there's like a discontent, like they're discontented with things. Um, and they might be seeing like certain patterns repeat themselves relationally over and over again. Like you know, it's a different person, but same relational dynamic. Um, a lot of people come in when they just kind of feel a little bit of rock bottom, and they know something needs to change, and they're really unhappy with themselves. They don't like they're not proud of themselves, they don't like themselves a lot, they don't feel good about their bodies, they don't feel good about their what they're doing for work. And this is like the discontented stuff that I'm talking about. Like they just don't feel content or confident, or really like happy with themselves, their relationships, and their lives. And so they come in because of a breakup, or because they just like don't know what to do about their relationship with their parents anymore, or because they they're so unhappy in their current relationship they don't know what to do, or they're so stressed and overwhelmed, or they're experiencing panic attacks. And like, so you have all these like little like branches, but like the core theme is this like pervasive discontentedness, and this sense that like they can see these patterns repeating themselves and they don't know how to change them or what to do about them, and they feel trapped or stuck, um, and a little bit like at a loss of what to do. um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's yeah.
Yeah, I get what you're saying because, oftentimes, like for example, let's just take couples for example. Let's say we see a couple in a relationship, but suddenly one person is emotionally attached to one thing that person cannot stop and really um be grounded in reality. Like
Mm, mm,
the most prominent example that I can think of is religion, because religion
mm.
itself, the people become so obsessed with one thing that they don't, they go down this rabbit hole of insanity. You know what I mean?
That's a good example because I mean, I guess that what that sparks in my brain is that I actually do see a lot of people who are doing religious deconstruction, which means that they have they're no longer religious, but the and I'm also not I'm not like completely hands down like against spirituality or anything like
Yeah,
that, but
they've become
um
radicalized to the point.
yeah, or they've been harmed in the religion. You know,
Mhm.
they've been really harmed, and they've they've started to see how things have like just the discontented that I'm talking about. Like they're having to put aside what they need in order to be a part of something. And that's really pervasive. Like if you're having to repress pieces of yourself or consistently feel like certain core pieces of yourself are bad in order to be a part of a relationship or a religion or a workplace, that is damaging over time, and it will lead to burnout, it will lead to trauma. um, and so I have people come in who are looking to either they've left a current thing, but they're still left with those internalized messages, and trying to figure out how to proceed. Um, a really good example would be, um, a client. This is kind of like an example of a lot of things that my clients might deal with. Is someone who's not religious anymore, but really struggling with their body image and also with their relationships, because they still and confidence, and they still have a lot of beliefs about like what a woman should be or should do, um, that is still based in those religious beliefs, even though they're not religious anymore. And so then they end up still repressing pieces of themselves and feeling unhappy in their current relationships, even though they're not religious anymore. Yeah, that would be like an example.
Yeah, it's great that you bring up this whole body image thing, because I remember watching a movie where there's one woman, who works as at an advertising company. She's trying to figure out how to fit in with the rest of society. And I remember
Mm,
this one scene where she looks at a mirror and kind of says to herself, I don't feel happy with my own body image. I need to do this, this, and this. But later on in the movie, she starts to realize that what makes her happy is not how she weighs, but she's happy with herself.
yeah, yeah, that's a lot of the work that we try to do in therapy, is trying to get that place. And that's really hard when you have multiple places, you know, your it could be your family, friends, your society just in general telling you that you don't fit in, or you can only fit in if you act, behave, look, and do certain things, um, which is unfortunate, right? Like
Yeah.
that sucks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but like moving on, like what impact does your work have on the greater community? In other words, what like doing this, what do you sort of learn, as you sort of meet with clients and say, I learned something new because you learn something new every day, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, yes. So that's such a great question because I think that we all should be working towards impact on the community. I currently, right now, like if you look at therapy as my impact on the community, um, which I've always, which is part of a reason that has like driven my work too, is I really do believe that therapists are kind of like culture makers. Like we're sort of these behind the scenes workers that are impacting. It's a very the word I want to use. It's a very important role. Like it needs to be handled with care, right? Because you can have a lot of impact for better and for worse. And not all therapists are good at their job, and not all therapists believe the same thing. Um, but there's a lot of ways that we can impact people's psyche and beliefs. So, for me, when I work with people, I really see one individual healing is super important. Like the more I can help people heal from their individual trauma, but also from the trauma that society perpetuates around, racism, ableism, sexism, like, colonialism, all of these things. If if I can help people understand that their personal suffering is impacted, um, and sometimes directly caused by systems that are greater than like just these like small personal experiences, not that they're small, but like than just your family or just your school experience, that these are part of like greater systems, then my hope is that as people start to connect those dots, they help bring others into that awareness that it's like a ripple effect, and that we all then can come together more to create more collective change around these systems, and build more community in the first place. I talk a lot to my clients about the importance of community. Therapy is very limited, right? Like I can help you, I can help you process your trauma. I can help you deconstruct your beliefs and move into new ones, but I can't make you not lonely, right? Like you need friends, you need community. I can't jump your car or come watch your dog or go partying with you on your birthday or something like that. Like we need friends and community. And so I talk a lot to my clients about like ways that we can build that more. And so I really see myself and my impact on the community as sort of this like, it's not massive, but it has this like ripple effect when you're trying to support other people in not just healing themselves, but also understanding and advocating for us all to like make more collective change. And yeah, just kind of like doing that one person at a time, or like in a group, and helping to educate people and motivate them to not just create change in their own life, but like also be change agents like in their community and for other people, and ultimately like in our structures.
Mm-hmm. So you said like at the beginning that you focused on like the social justice aspect of this um before. So like is there any sort of social justice piece that you would want to incorporate into your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely already do. It's very incorporated into my practice. It really depends on the client, but I would say that, I'm from Portland, and I live in well, most of my career has been in Portland, and most of my clients are in Oregon. And then I currently live in Washington. I have a lot of clients in Washington too. So most of my clients that come to me are also social justice focused, or they're open to having those conversations, which is nice because it's not necessarily like new material that I can introduce, but it's it's really different with each client. I might not The way that I tend to focus on social justice is, um, I might not always use certain terms in my practice, but I'm always trying to help people when they're talking about, for example, maybe this is best illustrated with like a concrete example. I have so many people that come to me who are incredibly burnt out and stressed in their job. And, you know, if I wasn't social justice focused, or if I wasn't like systems focused, I could essentially do CBT with them, DBT, and be like, okay, how can you cope better with the stress so that you can get back to work? Um, which is not what I do, right? Because I don't really think any of us should be working as much as we do anyway. I think a lot of us are being taken advantage by corporate greed. And so instead, we talk about the existential conversations around what it means to be working this much as a human when we weren't meant to be, like how they can advocate for themselves at work, sometimes helping them leave work and find something different, helping them build more community support, so maybe they feel like they don't, are relying on each other more instead of relying on paying for all these different services. um, and you know to me that is a very like, mm, non-theoretical but like concrete way that we can implement social justice, especially in therapy practice, is even just like where we guide people. I'm usually guiding people towards like validating their experience and helping them connect it to these larger systems we have involved, which is, that like corporations like to pay us as little as possible, typically for the max profit, and like they're not there necessarily to support your well-being. So like you have to advocate for yourself. Um, so yeah, that's a small example of what it looks like, but it can look like a lot of different things, um, down to just directly helping people unpack like their own internalized isms, internalized, white supremacy, internalized ableism, internalized anti-fatness, like all of that kind of stuff comes up directly too. And I see that as social justice work when I'm helping people recognize that they've absorbed a message from society that they don't actually like, and that's like harmful to them and other people. But it's not as easy as just being like, oh, I don't like this, so I'll just not believe this. Like we've been trained to believe it, and it's detrimental to our mental health. And so you typically need help with that. You need help to change those beliefs over time and help to like let go of some of that stuff that we all were um, kind of trained in. So yeah, I think that's how I practice it the most.
Yeah, to kind of wrap this up, like what can other psychologists who are wanting to enter, the field, what can they sort of learn to like, because oftentimes this field is very complex and also, um,
Hmm.
it also can be very fun, you know what I mean? Because
Hmm.
for people who are entering the psychology field is what I'm asking.
Yeah. So you're asking like
What advice
for,
would you give to
yeah,
people who are entering the psychology realm?
yeah. Oh my goodness. I probably have lots of advice to give. I supervise people too, so I really enjoy mentorship for people who are just getting in the field. But I would say the major advice that I would give people is to really invest in what's called person of the therapist work, and that's um, really understanding yourself, getting comfortable, which also means like getting comfortable with conflict with other people, um, understanding why you're drawn to this field, what you're trying to heal, what your own personal triggers are, what it means to be a therapist in this society. Um, there's there's so much material there. I think if we get super, and that's almost like touched on a bit in grad school, but I do feel like if you're entering the field, like it needs to be a focus because um, otherwise, I feel like this work can burn you out and it can become robotic or it can make you really anxious because you feel like you need to just get certified in a million things and that makes you a good therapist. Essentially, like you need to invest in the relational aspect, which means you need to really understand yourself um, as much as possible, and that's a lifelong journey. So it needs to be a practice, but to yeah, but to invest in that practice and to find other therapists that are invested in that practice because that's what's going to make you like not only like help you heal personally, but also it's what's gonna make you a really good therapist and a confident therapist instead of feeling insecure a lot, which I think a lot of the therapists do because it's a hard job.
Mm-hmm.
So
I
yeah,
bet it.
that would be my advice.
I bet it is. Yeah. All right.